Hello, it's me, Catherine Collert Page, here again with another writing process tip. Today I'm talking about revising, and I'm talking about when to quit revising, which is a terrible topic because there's not a particularly good answer to that question, other than you're going to quit a lot later than you might think, but at some point you have to. At some point you have to get your work out there in the world. So, um, new writers, sometimes when they do a draft and they submit it for a critique or to a professor or a teacher and they're told to revise, can get really defeated. They think it means that they did something wrong. But that's not the case at all. I believe it may have been Richard Neumann who said that writing is revising. Anne Lamott, in her book Bird by Bird, you hear me talk about Anne Lamott a lot, and that's because she's amazing, and just about every writer I know, whether it's a legal writer or a fiction writer, loves Anne Lamott. Anne Lamott says that there is she has a term for the first draft that, since I am a law professor, I am not going to use in these YouTube videos. But let's just say that she calls it a poopy first draft. She uses another word, but essentially she says that everyone has a poopy first draft. Stop and think about that. It's true. Hemingway, Tolstoy, every writer, every Pulitzer Prize winner, we all have terrible first drafts. That's part of the process. It doesn't mean that you wasted your time if that first draft is bad. In fact, in my last installment, I talked about how both Cynthia Leidick-Smith and Tim Wynne-Jones deleted drafts and completely started over. And Tim Wynne-Jones won the National Book Award when he did that. So it doesn't mean that anything is wrong. Speaking of Hemingway, he's rumored to have revised the last chapter of A Farewell to Arms 16 times, which actually doesn't sound like that much to me. So, yes, revision will be a part of the writing process. You will revise a lot. If you are a law student, you're going to be submitting around your writing sample as you apply for jobs. And that's actually how I really learned a lot of writing skills. Is every single time I submitted that writing sample, I gave it a once-over again, fussed around with the sentence structure, looked at punctuation and grammar, and it's amazing how every time you can always find something new to change. With respect to my legal articles, I'll admit that I look back at them now and I still have that moment where I think, this first part is kind of clunky, it needs some transitions. I wish I could fix it. Each of them, there are things that I look back and I still wish I could fix, and I wish I'd fussed around with it some more. The great thing about those, at least, is that if you're on a grant, there's a deadline, and so you have to get it submitted at a certain point in time. Deadlines are great. If you have a deadline for your class that you're in, that will force you to turn it in at a certain point in time. However, because revision is such a key part of the process, you want to allow a whole lot more time for revision than you think you'll need. In fact, it always takes longer than you think it will. Still, for me, after all of these years of writing, it takes so much longer than I think it will every single time. So what do you do with spec work? Well, that's a good question. Personally, I have 2 completed novels that I've revised, one of which I have never submitted, ever, because I know it needs revision and I'm interested in other projects right now. So I need to get back to that one and revise it. The other I submitted a little bit and then decided it needed more revision, and then didn't submit again and didn't really want to work on it. And recently I was talking to a writer named Cheryl Berglund Coupe. She's also an editor. Very sensible woman. She said that she hits a point with her writing where she realizes it's not going to get any better on its own, that she needs the input of an agent or an editor to take it to that next level, that she needs to work with someone else on it before it gets there. And so she just goes ahead and lets it go and submits it. That strikes me as good advice, and it's really percolating, and I think that I'm going to send that novel of mine back out there again. In fact, I mentioned in my last installment that I submitted it just a few times and I got what are known as good rejections. You know, agent told me, hey, it's not for me, but I know some agent is going to love it, and you know, similar rejection from a publishing house. And so that says to me that I probably gave up a little bit too soon on that one. And so maybe we can all sort of agree together that if we have a piece of fiction work that we know is not going to get any better on its own, that we're going to send it out there. Other than that, you know, to say what criteria you would need to meet to stop revising would be to go over the requirements for an entire legal writing course or an entire MFA program. However, that being said, sometimes your professor may give you a checklist if you're in a legal writing course. Recently, that same writer that I mentioned, Cheryl Berglund Coupe, sent around a checklist that Pixar had come up with for good storytelling. It doesn't all get down to a checklist, but something like that is sort of a nifty guide for going back and examining your work. I'll admit that the one other fear that I have too, there are certain writers that are very popular, but whose work I do not admire. I can think of one particular adverb lover who has been raked over the coals in just about every graduate lecture that I heard, but particularly popular writer. And I sort of think, well, you know, I don't care as much about being popular, although that would be nice, as I do about making sure that the work I put out there is good. You know, one other guideline I would use is, how did you feel when you were revising? So again, in my last installment, I talked about how that same novel, the one that I need to go ahead and send out, at one point there was a terrible, terrible version of that novel that was the second version that I wound up throwing out entirely. And I had sent it in to my advisor, Ellen Howard, and I was writing defensively. I was writing from an insecure place as I was tackling those revisions. And Ellen came back to me and she said, "You've made it worse." And I love her for that. And she was right. I had made it worse. So, you know, are you in that state of flow where you really believe in the work when you're revising, or does it feel insecure? Does it feel defensive? If so, you know, revision isn't necessarily always a good thing. You may be making it worse. However, even if you have one of those bad revisions where you have made it worse and you have revised defensively, all is still not lost. It was still part of your writing process. For me, that was how I got to that later draft that was approved as my creative thesis, and that really got some kind of positive feedback the first time out on the dance floor, considering that I only submitted a couple of times. So, revise a lot more than you think you would. Allow time for that revision. Do get your stuff out there in the world, even though you may groan later. I mean, even Tolstoy later, Tolstoy disavowed Anna Karenina. So, there's always going to be something you wish you could change. So get it out there at some point in time. Do pay attention to how you feel as you are revising, but make your voice heard. All right, right on.